Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. My name is Anton Garcia-Fernandez, coming to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee, right here in the United States of America. And every year around this time, we record a special Bing Crosby podcast. And for the past several years, it's been yours truly with Malcolm Macfarlane. But today we have more people on deck to talk about Bing Crosby and to concentrate on a very special year in his life and his career and in his musical and cinematic legacy. Of course, we're going to be talking with some friends and fellow members of the International Club Crosby, and as I always say, and this is very appropriate for this year of 1954, we hope that you'll enjoy this conversation of ours, which you might like if you're snowbound or if there's a bus strike or something. I always say that. And over in the United Kingdom, we have three friends who are huge Bing Crosby fans, starting with my friend Malcolm Macfarlane. Malcolm, welcome
Hi.
to the Jazz Flashes podcast.
Thank you. Good
Also,
to be here.
Yeah, it's very nice to be able to talk about Bing, and this time we have a foursome here. It looks like golf a little bit, doesn't it? And also in the UK, we have Jason Liddiard. He's been leading all the online meetings that the ICC has been hosting for the last few months. Jason, welcome to this special edition of the Jazz Flashes podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Anton. I've been looking forward to it because I usually watch your podcasts afterwards. Always found them really interesting, and I have to say, I feel like I'm in the big league today with you guys being here.
Well, we appreciate your being here, and we also have today another member of the International Club Crosby and Bing Crosby fan, Ken Crossland. Ken, welcome to the Jazz Flashes podcast this year.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, we're going to be talking today, all four of us, about Bing Crosby in the year of 1954. And it was Ken's idea to concentrate on this year. So the first question, I think, is obviously necessary to ask Ken, why 1954 and not 53, 56, or 77?
Okay, well, 1954 was a pivotal year for Bing, and it was a pivotal year for me as well, because it's the year I was born. So you'll forgive me if my memories of Bing in 1954 are a little sketchy. I didn't actually arrive until a quarter of the way through the year in April, but and it's 70 years ago. So my 70th birthday comes around next April. So for all of those kind of reasons, 1954 is kind of strong in my mind at the moment with that anniversary coming up. But from Bing's point of view, it just it struck me as a year where a number of things ended and one or two other things began, and it was in that sense quite pivotal for Bing. It was in his personal life quite a pivotal year because he'd been a widower for a little over 12 months when the year started. Had his share of lady companions, but it was during that year that he first dated Catherine, who of course became his second wife. And with her, he produced his second family, which clearly had a massive impact on his priorities and his interest in show business and performing, I think, for many years to come. So that was one significant milestone. It was also significant in that Bing ended his weekly variety radio show that dated all the way back to the mid-30s with the Kraft Music Hall, because his General Electric shows ended in the spring of 1954, very much around the time when television was displacing that kind of medium in terms of popularity. But Bing, of course, did cling on to radio and started a new radio venture later in the year, still for CBS, with the shorter daily radio shows, which spawned so many of the great recordings with Buddy Cole that we still enjoy. But nevertheless, it was a step down in terms of radio and radio production and so on that Bing saw. And whilst Bing debuted on television in 1954, in fact, the first week in 1954, his first solo TV show went out. It was a rather tentative beginning, with him sort of dipping a toe in the water and not much more than that. And certainly as compared to the commitment that other performers were making to television, notably Perry Como, Dinah Shore, Dean Martin to an extent, it was a much more limited and unenthusiastic response, I think, would be my summary. And then later in the year, of course, we saw the arrival of two major films for Bing, Country Girl and White Christmas. But with the exception of High Society that came around 2 years later, those two were the two final bookmarks in Bing's career as a major film star. There were other film performances, but you'd struggle to really put any kind of mark against any of them from 1956 onwards. And I think High Society was a kind of a one-off because it was a mega cast and so on. So for me, the curtain probably really came down with White Christmas, which came out at the end of 54. And then finally, it didn't happen in 54, but Bing's 20-year association and contract with Decca Records was clearly running out of steam during 1954. It ended in 1955. Bing moved on to a freelance basis and was never quite the same in terms of his focus and commitment to recording the way he'd been for the many years before. And it was probably 20 years before Bing rediscovered a kind of focus and channel for his professional activities. And that came about when he met Ken Barnes in 1974. And for the last 3 years of his life, we saw a new channeling of Bing towards recording, towards live performing, towards television shows that we hadn't seen for the 20 years that had gone before. And whilst we'll kick around and discuss some of the reasons, and it's entirely understandable why Bing kind of thought he was running out of steam in 1954, we actually had 20 years of being in a sort of professional wilderness, and so much more could have happened that in those years that we would be now sitting here and enjoying. And it's a shame that that those years were lost.
I agree. If only he'd started touring. Look at Como. When he was winding down, he started touring. And
Yes.
if Bing had done that, it would have changed his whole career, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think the real difference was age there, wasn't it? Bing was the older statesman. He started recording professionally in 1926. There were no other recording performers who'd been around for as long as he has. And if you look at his age already, turned 50, it probably was a kind of semi-retirement approach at that time.
Yeah, it's also the year that Bill Haley recorded Rock Around the Clock, ushering in rock and roll. And of course, that would eventually completely change the record business with the arrival of Elvis Presley and all the rockers. And then later in the 60s, it would be the British invasion. So, it's really a pivotal year. And I'm thinking, that maybe we could structure the conversation by talking about all those different elements to Bing Crosby's figure. We could, talk about him on records in 1954, on radio and television, on the silver screen, and then also something about his personal life, which was also changing in those days. Since we were talking about records, maybe we could start by talking about Bing Crosby as a recording artist in 1954, because I find it very interesting that sometime in 1954, Bing Crosby sort of decides that he may want to quit singing, not sing anymore. He's talking in a letter to John Scott Trotter that talking about the fact that he is not sure he wants to keep singing, that he's not singing as well as he had done before, that the songs are not quite as good as they once used to be. What do you guys think about that? Do you agree with Bing that he wasn't singing as good as he had before? Why do you think he was feeling that way? Because, if you look at the recordings that he made in 1954 and then later in 55, 56, 57, many of those are just as good as they had ever been. Of course, there are some records that are not as good, but in general, the quality is pretty high, I think.
Yeah, I think at that time, Bing probably took the decision to actually reinvent himself. When he said he wasn't singing as well as before, clearly he was talking about, I think, as far back as the mid-30s, and obviously that was a given. But as you say, from 55, 56, 57, Bing suddenly sounded different to the way he did in 53, 54. And as I say, whether that was a conscious decision to reinvent himself, I don't know. And certainly by the end of the 50s, he was a baritone who was quite often singing in the bass range. And probably that started around the time of Gigi. I think also some of the material, Bing was lucky during his film career singing songs that were penned by the likes of Irving Berlin. Well, even the songs for The Country Girl were written by Howard Arlen and Ira Gershwin. But then there were the songs like you just mentioned, Bill Haley, that type of rock and roll or novelty song. I'm sure Bing wasn't comfortable. And in fact, one of his early recordings in 54, I think, was "Oh Baby Mine, I Get So Lonesome,"
country
which
song.
I'm sure was a very much tongue-in-cheek song for Bing to sing. I mean, he pulls it off really well, and I think he really does, does the song very well. But I think at the same time, it was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek performance from him on that one.
Yeah, that's a country song actually from Johnny and Jack, a huge duo in the country field. They did songs like "Poison Love" and "Oh Baby Mine" and a few others. And I was always surprised that Bing chose to sing that song. I think accompanied by Guy Lombardo, no less. But
Malcolm may know the answer to this, but who was managing Bing in 1954?
I don't think anyone was really. He got agents, 1 or 2 agents he was using, but I think he was very much a sole trader, wasn't he, in many ways?
And Jack Cap died by then.
Yes, he died in 49.
Right. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's probably how Bing wanted it, but you do get a sense that there was nobody shaping and really directing him.
No.
Or trying to create some ambition. He was left to follow whatever was going through his head. I mean, you're right, Anton. The John Scott Trotter letter is quite telling. Yet the tonal quality of his voice around the time of the musical autobiography set is fantastic. I mean, that voice, that's the Bing Crosby voice that I fell in love with. That beautiful, rich tonal quality. It was quite a shock to me when I started, when I was 15, 16, started buying Bing Crosby records, and I'd never heard the early 30s Bing, and it was a real shock to me when I did hear it. So it was such a different sounding voice. It was that lovely mellow baritone was what I fell in love with, and there was as Jason says, the quality stayed with that. It got a little deeper as he got older, but there was so much there that he could work with.
That's the kind of a voice that I think Michael Holiday was going for too when he was trying to sound like Bing, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Because it was a quality that went straight to your heart. at that time. You know,
Malcolm, why do you
could,
think Bing
when
was
Bing sang, you could feel it in your chest.
Yes.
That's right. Why do you think, Malcolm, that Bing was feeling that way? How would you read that letter that he writes to John Scott Trotter?
Well, I suppose GE, they weren't prepared to pay a lot of money for a radio show. They want him to do television. He didn't want to do it. So money would come into it. In the end, he went for that 15-minute show. His film contract with Paramount was due to expire. So he no fixed relationships. He got problems with his sons. And also, something we tend to forget, he was often in a lot of pain with his kidney stones.
Mm-hmm.
That would affect your mentality quite a bit. If you every day you think, oh my God, these pains, it must have been a real strain for him at that time.
He seems to have undergone surgery even for kidney problems in 1954, most definitely in 1955. But
yes,
I think that is important, and that's something though that doesn't come across at all in his recordings. This is something that he did record in 1954, and to me, this is really a landmark project for many reasons in Bing Crosby's career. I'm talking about the musical autobiography, which I bought years ago at Tower Records in Nashville, Tennessee. And I was always very surprised by this album for two reasons. First of all, because I love the spoken introductions. You know how much I love Bing Crosby's speaking voice, which was beautiful. But then also because the earlier records he re-records with Buddy Cole. And this is Bing reinterpreting songs that were by 1954 more than 20 years old, or just around 20 years old. What is your general comment about this musical autobiography, which then other artists would take up, and this idea would be also taken up by other singers, Nat King Cole, Louis Armstrong, but Bing Crosby did it first and did it very well.
Yeah. Well, I'm older than you chaps, and I remember in the late 50s saving up to buy the 5 LP set. And to me, this was so precious. And the first two albums, 2 LPs, were re-recordings with Buddy Cole, but it was the rest of that set I played more often because these were Bing. It was Bing at his peak. The last 3 LPs, I absolutely loved them. Took me a while to get used to the first 2 LPs with Buddy Cole. The first one, first of all, the first one was issued singly, and I bought that. And then, of course, I found out it was part of a set, and saved up to get it. And I think it probably changed my appreciation of Bing. I thought this was Bing at the top, and I hadn't heard some of those records before. Wonderful, very expensive though, to a teenager in the late 50s.
Well, it's I think it's remarkable that Bing actually found the motivation to record that set. I mean, I suspect quite a lot of the drive behind that came from Buddy Cole, because given Bing's sort of waning interest, you can imagine it would have been quite a hard sell to him that, come on, Bing, we're going to put 4.5 hours out of your career. You could just imagine him saying, well, nobody's interested in me anymore, and so on, and then persuading him to do whatever it was, 40 odd recordings of albeit a little bit shorter than normal for those 2 albums. So somebody must have really had to manage him through that, and I suspect it was Buddy Cole. I mean, I remember buying I bought volume 2 volumes. There were single LPs, Malcolm, of volumes 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And they were still in the catalogue when I started buying records, about 1968, and in England it was on the Brunswick label, and most of the Brunswick albums were being deleted at that time, so you couldn't just walk in the shop and order them. I eventually found quite an enterprising record shop manager who would do his best to get me these things, and I think I bought 2 or 3 records of Bing to start with. I was very much guided by my mother as to what, I wanted something with all Bing Crosby's best songs on. And so I think I ended up buying Bing the Early 30s, Volume 1, because she recognized a lot of the titles. But the voice was that strange voice that I'd not really heard before, and I wasn't much interested in that. And eventually we settled on Volume 2 of the autobiography because it had so many great songs on there, Mexicali Rose and Only Forever and Tumbling Tumbleweeds and so on. And so it was about probably the fourth or fifth Bing Crosby LP that I bought. But of course, when I then played it, I'd never heard the originals of all of those songs. My first hearing of them was all through the autobiography set, and I just fell in love with those autobiography recordings because I love that voice, the voice of that time. And even to this day, I'd much prefer, I think, the 54 Mexicali Rose to the 38 Mexicali Rose and so on, because I've been sort of conditioned that way. There were great covers, by the way. Just the individual set LPs had great covers. There was a sort of caricature of Bing in a recording studio or something for the first two. And I know in the States, I think they issued 3, 4, and 5 as single LPs as well on Decca. And they had great covers too. Much better than the box, actually.
I tell you what I liked. One of the things I really liked about the box set was the booklet. Wonderful notes with a whole list of all Bing's recording for Decca, which I knew. I remember ticking them all off over the years. Oh, here's another one. Got that one. It was very good booklet.
When I first bought it, it was in that yellow MCA cardboard box. Do you remember that one? And the thing I remember about it was I was actually drawn to the first LP, the recordings with Buddy Cole, because I found that was my introduction to Bing's humor, like his very self-deprecating humor and some of his phrases, like being a sea-level baritone and things like that. And I found it really amusing. And also, and I think just by coincidence that we covered some of 1954 on one of our earlier Zoom meetings, and I played the opening track at the Mississippi Mud, with Buddy Cole, and that is a recording that stands up and stands alone by itself. It's a great swinging recording that Bing did for that opener on that box set. Yeah, and of course we have the CD now, and it's great, isn't it?
Yeah. Whilst pretending to say Bing was past it, etc., etc., he did have 5 chart hits that year, which is not bad for any artist to get 5 records in the hit parade in a given year.
And in the musical autobiography, I think picked a number 9 on Billboard, being as expensive as it was at the time.
Yeah.
And I suppose that those first 2 albums and the kind of short versions he did of all those songs, that was almost the beginning of the Crosby medley, wasn't it? That we saw in the last. Years of his life. There was a massive overlap between what he included in that medley and what was in those first 2 of the autobiographies.
And it's the kind of stuff he'd be doing for CBS radio with Buddy Cole very soon in those 15-minute daily broadcasts. One of the reasons why I really like those early tracks, even though they're shorter, and of course they can be compared with the originals, and some are better, some maybe not. But one of the things that I like is the fact that Bing Crosby is singing with a jazz small group. And, I don't think Bing did that enough. And so, having the CBS radio shows and having the musical autobiography is wonderful for that reason, because you can hear how jazzy Bing's singing was in that kind of a context, in that kind of a setting. And then, as Jason was mentioning, the introductions are wonderful. Of course, they're scripted, but somehow Bing has the ability to make them sound like they're not scripted, like he's just coming up with them on the spot. And I think that that's very little talked about, but I think that's just some magical element that Bing Crosby had to his persona. that he was able to make anything scripted sound like it wasn't, or pretty much by this time. So
The
I just
natural
love the
actor in
musical
him, lovely.
autobiography for all those reasons.
I thought that was really interesting what you said as well, Anton, about the small group jazz settings, because as you say, some of those records were almost the forerunners to what we heard shortly afterwards on Some Fine Old Chestnuts. And what's the album with the dog emblem on the front? New Tricks.
New Tricks, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, I think Decca was mastering some of his radio work for commercial release.
They were,
So, that's, I think, one of the reasons why those songs just sound so great. Bing Crosby on radio was doing those CBS radio shows, 15 minutes every evening. The ratings were pretty good, and fortunately, they were all pre-recorded, and so they've all been preserved and reissued on this expensive but well worth it box set by Mosaic, which includes all the CBS radio recordings known to exist, made between 1954 and 1956. Maybe this is a good way to kind of segue into Bing Crosby's radio work in 1954 and also television work. I think it was either Malcolm or Ken that mentioned that Bing Crosby did not like doing TV work in those early years. Do you have any explanation for that? I know Frank Sinatra was very dismissive of television as well because he didn't like to rehearse and he thought it just took too long. What was Bing Crosby's objection to TV work around this time?
I think he I can't remember the words he used. It took so long to record it, and he was better off making a film. I think was his feeling. He certainly seemed, of course, he was singing to playbacks as well, which he was used to in films. It had to be filmed. He didn't do it live until later on. I quite like
There was a letter in sometime in '54. I think it was a letter where round about because he did the second show for GE which he filmed in February, I think, which went out about Easter time. And then there was a sort of press release that he wasn't going to do any more television. And I don't know if it's a letter or an interview, but he was quoted as saying, well, he thought it was too intrusive. He said you wouldn't dream of having a different movie out every week and having that sort of piped into people's homes. And he thought that there's a danger that you would become too familiar a face if you were turning up all the time, which was. And I think a lot of the Sinatra as well too, but I think probably several other performers who were sort of creatures of the movie era probably had that sort of mindset. And Malcolm and I know from the book we did on Perry Como that it was almost the fact that Como was spectacularly unsuccessful in movies that sort of opened the door for him to actually be such a success on TV, because he had this quite understated personality that didn't work on the big screen but was perfect for the sort of weekly television show. And I guess Bing was accustomed to I don't know what's the word, perhaps a more grandiose billing in a film and a different sort of role that he did very well. And I think Malcolm's right. Como was brilliant with the spontaneity. He did the shows live, and when he almost traded on the fact that something would go wrong in the course of the live show, and then would make something of it. Whereas Bing was very much, as you say, accustomed to lip syncing his vocals, and the early shows were pre-recorded, weren't they? As filmed. Yeah,
there was quite a contrast between those first two General Electric TV shows. The first one, and I think again we showed this on one of our monthly meetings, had some fairly good production values, like the dancing in You'll Come, and then Buddy Cole at the piano, and also the I Love Paris kind of scenery and setup. Whereas the second version, it was almost you could be mistaken for Bing just putting in a radio performance, just standing there and singing his two or three solos, you know, with no backing and no production values. I always wondered why that was so different between the first and second TV program.
I think there's another thing that I would add to the idea that Bing was accustomed to the movies, but Bing was a huge radio star, and I think he understood radio as a medium where the voice is very important, where you can create a persona through your voice without really needing anything else. And he definitely had the voice for radio, and he had the voice for singing and for speaking. So I would imagine that adding the extra visual element he might not think was necessary at that time. Of course, TV was gaining importance, but in the early 50s, radio was still pretty powerful. So I would imagine that would have something to do with it as well.
Yes, those half-hour GE shows, which carried on until May 54, some great singing on them. I mean, the two shows he did with Sinatra, and wonderful singing together. His show with Ella Fitzgerald, some great stuff there. All of it pre-recorded beforehand and stitched together by the recording engineers, Murdo Mackenzie and Bill Morrow, etc. In fact, Bob Phillips is going to talk on your next Zoom meeting, I think, isn't he, Jason? He'll probably be covering that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we'll be covering all of the different building facilities and recording studios that are being used throughout radio and TV. I'm hoping people will find it interesting, because obviously I've seen the presentation, I've been through that, and I think it'd probably be a bit of a joint effort between myself and Bob to present that, because as you know, his voice is failing somewhat. But yeah, I'm sure all members will find that really interesting come January.
Of course, the spontaneity of radio had gone by then as well, hadn't it? Because as you say, Malcolm, the GEC shows were all sort of pre-packaged.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Whereas for many years, Bing had been accustomed to turning up with recording the show with the script in his hand and the guests there. And he could be brilliantly spontaneous, as that wonderful duet with Louis Armstrong, where from about 51 on the Kiss to Build a Dream on, where if somebody decides at the last minute this should be a duet, not a Bing solo, and they are literally making it up as they go along. But it's wonderful improvisation in that. But that had gone from radio, and it was kind of there in television, but Bing hadn't found it in television by that as yet, and possibly never did. Because he was still lip syncing TV songs, wasn't he? Into the early 60s.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
I find it interesting that he didn't like TV in the early days, because later on he would become a very important presence on television in the United States. Malcolm?
Right. Yes, I agree. Some of his TV shows in the late 50s seemed to be recorded live. The Edsel Show, for instance, that was an outstanding show. And he certainly wasn't lip syncing in that. That was absolutely a superb show, Bing at his best.
Yeah. Did you guys think that Bing was lip syncing, for example, on It Had to Be You in that first TV show? Because that to me seems to be a live performance, because he changes the lyrics.
Yes.
I think that one was live. I mean, that was odd, wasn't it? Because the other end of the spectrum, You All Come was actually mimed to the record. And I don't, was Changing Partners, was that mimed to the record as well in that? Not sure. But no, I always thought It Had to Be You was a live vocal.
Yeah, and I think Dear Hearts as well in the second program.
Sorry, say again, Jason.
Dear Hearts and Gentle People in the second program, I think that's a live recording too, again, because Bing changes the lyrics somewhat.
Yeah, and hits a high note at the end.
That's right. It's unexpected, isn't it? It takes
quite weird,
After that second GE show in 54, how long was it before Bing did another TV show with him as the star?
Well, he did Person to Person in the late 50s.
with Edward Murrow, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
it. Interview, that was all, all interviewed live. But the next
But
singing one was 56.
was
Edsel.
Edsel.
57.
57. Yeah. So it's 3 years, wasn't it? Really.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so it really was a kind of dip your toe in the water and not really like it and go back. Yeah, because interesting.
But he maintained his
staggering, really. By 57, color TV, I think, had arrived, hadn't it, in the States? And Bing was still at first base.
He did maintain a presence on radio, though, in 1954. We had mentioned that he'd been doing the Bing Crosby show for General Electric with different guests. And something that I find really interesting, and I think maybe we could touch upon this a little bit because it has to do with his radio presence in the year of 1954, is the fact that his son, Gary Crosby, becomes a summer replacement for Bing's show. And there's a kind of like an interesting dynamic there between Gary Crosby as the host, carrying on the Crosby tradition, but not being exactly like his father and being constantly compared with his father. And then also the comments that Bing Crosby has in a letter to John Scott Trotter, who is the musical director of the show, of course, about Gary Crosby's ability or inability to sing ballads. Let's talk a little bit about that summer replacement, 13 weeks, I think, of Gary Crosby hosting this show.
And I think Bing also had some input as to what they could and couldn't record. Didn't want him sounding too sexy and things like that.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard any of his shows, actually, Gary Crosby shows. He had some quite good guests. I gather the script was written by the regular guys, and the regular musicians were there, so it was just swapping Gary for Bing, wasn't it, really?
But I think that Bing had some ideas about, the fact that Gary was not great at singing ballads, that he was writing Trotter about, what kinds of songs maybe he should be giving him, the kind of tempos and that kind of thing. And it's interesting because obviously, that couldn't have made it easy I'm sure he was trying to help, but at the same time, that couldn't have made it easy on Gary. Bing Crosby talking about the fact that Gary had not really done a lot of singing, and that, basically he's saying he is, without saying it really, he's saying that, he is hosting the show because it's his son in a way,
Yes.
Yeah.
So that can't be, psychologically a very good situation for Gary, even though, of course, the cards are stacked in his favor since he is Bing Crosby's son.
And you wonder how all of that must have worked, given that the relationship between Bing and Gary was probably quite strained for most of that time, for no other reason than Gary was, coming through adolescence and starting to get himself into scrapes and so on, and presenting Bing with situations that Bing probably wasn't well engineered to deal with. So to have a sort of professional relationship laid over that as well couldn't have been easy.
Yeah. And finding that Bing's latest girlfriend was roughly the same age as Gary.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Yeah, well, all of this probably, had something to do with Bing's decision to not keep doing this kind of show and switch to a 15-minute show, which was originally a sustaining show for the first few weeks, and then had a variety of sponsors. What do you guys think about that show? That's about one of my favorite parts of Bing Crosby's radio career. Of course, the Kraft Music Hall was fantastic, but the quality of the recordings, the sound, even the scripts for this 15-minute show is just fantastic. And we find Bing Crosby also talking about present day matters, things that were in the news, and things like religion even, and stuff like that. So what do you think about that show? I really like it. I must put it out there.
I found the chat a bit boring. 2 or 3 minutes talking about baseball or something like that.
Racetracks and stuff, yeah.
Yeah, it didn't turn me on, quite honestly. But
Yeah, the latest book that you've read and things like that. Yeah.
yes, that's right.
Yeah,
I would agree with Anton
know.
though regarding the quality of the recordings, because clearly the recording engineers captured everything, and now we're able to play back, so much more, aren't we?
Yeah.
I actually do like
balance.
it for one more reason. It's almost like, it's not really, and I think I'm exaggerating here a little bit, but it's almost like a forerunner to the podcast, because it's Bing Crosby basically.
Yes.
It's not free association because it is scripted and everything. But again, he makes it look like he's coming up with these things on the spot, and I just find his speaking voice so fascinating that I don't really care what he's talking about.
Yeah, I've never really listened to many of those shows. I must confess, I love the singing, but the chat. It's kind of, oh, no, 30 seconds of it, and I'm winding forward, really.
Well, interesting what you say about Bing's speaking voice as well. I think it was Michael Feinstein who said, "Oh, Bing's speaking voice is exquisite," and Sammy Davis Jr. He used to do lots of impersonations of the other singers, didn't he? And he said he couldn't even begin to impersonate Bing's singing voice, but he could do his speaking voice really well.
Yeah, you can hear that on the musical autobiography, how he introduces the songs, and then of course the radio shows had longer segments of Bing Crosby talking, and you can find some of those in different places online. And I must admit that once in a while I do play those, and not just for the music, although the music of course is the highlight, and one of the reasons why the ratings were actually pretty good. I was looking at the ratings that Malcolm had on the day-by-day book, and it says something about 3.1 in the Nielsen ratings, when Jack Benny had 5.8. It's not bad for a radio show. Do you guys think that Bing Crosby could see that this was the waning era of radio? Do you think he was aware of this at any point around this time?
Yes, certainly. The writing was on the wall, wasn't it? Absolutely on the wall.
I think that if you look at it from the other side of the coin, it would have been almost obvious that the television was on a massive upward curve, and gathering pace, and just displacing everything in its path. And you would have thought he'd have made that leap to the fact that this meant that radio would disappear.
Radio, it wasn't just Bing, of course, was it, that was affected by that? You mentioned Jack Benny, who obviously had a very successful TV show at that time, straight off the back of it was a tremendous transition actually from radio to TV for Jack Benny. Bob Hope as well, I guess, falls into the same category.
It's also a time really when television is kind of an extension of radio. The early TV shows were basically thought of as radio shows with images. I mean, that changed, of course, as television began, finding its medium and its mode of expression and all of that. But, some of the early TV shows here in the United States, if you look at them from the point of view of today, you can see the connection between radio and television in those early days. Then, of course, it's always said that the idea that vaudeville kind of carried on to the TV screen as well, and did not die the kind of death that many people thought had happened in the 1930s with the appearance of television and shows like Toast of the Town, which would become the Ed Sullivan Show, etc. There's a lot of vaudeville going on television in the 1950s. So I find that also, that connection, very very interesting.
One thing I perhaps ought to mention: Perry Como had his radio show in the late 40s. And then in December 48, they decided they'd televise it. And all they did was stick a camera in front of him as he did his radio show. It's quite funny to watch.
The script in his hand still.
Yeah.
Yeah, like watching the final Goon show. It was a similar experience, wasn't it? Yeah.
And once again, it's something that's very modern. It's happening all over again, because now you have radio shows that are being broadcast on YouTube. They're both broadcast on, let's say, BBC4, and on the radio, but you can also access them on YouTube. And basically, what they have is a camera in the studio while the people are talking on the radio. So pretty much everything seems to be cyclical. It kind of comes back after a while, goes away, then comes back. Well, one thing that is very important in 1954, and I think that Ken touched upon this at the beginning, and I think we need to talk more about this, is Bing Crosby as a movie star in 1954, because there are two releases that are extremely important in his career, both because of Bing Crosby's quality of acting, but also because, at least in my view, these two are among, and I think Malcolm and I have talked about this on previous years, of this podcast. These two movies are among two of Bing's best movies overall. So I'd like to talk about these movies a little more. And the first one of them is actually a Clifford Odets play or screenplay with Grace Kelly, William Holden. We're talking about The Country Girl. Now, what do you think about The Country Girl? To me, it's one of Bing's best movies in his whole career.
I agree, absolutely. A revelation his acting was in that. Incredibly good acting. The songs were rubbish, but I think they were only written really just to hang on the script, really. They weren't great songs.
I actually think the songs are pretty good. I find I watch them quite a lot. I think I love the the Search Is Through. I think
Search Is Through. I agree. Yeah.
Great, Crosby ballad, and actually it's the way it's portrayed in the film, where you see the recording session. Of course, is one of the, which I guess must have been not too far away from how they actually did recordings around about that time. So it's a sort of eye inside the studio, but. I think Bing's performance in the Pitchman song, the "It's Mine, It's Yours," I think that's. Yeah. The more I watch that, I really think he plays that part, gets into that character, just for that 3-minute clip of that song. It was for a long time. It was a song I would have kind of brushed over, but I think if you just listen to the record, it's nothing. But you watch the actual clip of him doing it from the film. And there's a lot in that. I agree. I mean, I think it was his best acting performance, and for a film that you'd want to sort of stand the test of time, that's almost as good as any, really, for Bing, because it's still got some nice singing there as well.
Yeah, I like the Love and Learn duet myself from that.
Yeah.
But getting back to Bing's acting in there, I wonder how much of it he was thinking was semi-autobiographical.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody at that point in their career, and there's that famous story about the scene at the table where Bing is really quite losing it, and I think the director George Stephen wanted him to pull his toupee off at that point, and I think that was a red line for Bing on that movie.
Yeah.
Well, he did have
I haven't heard that before.
imprint things he took off, didn't he? At one point, as though there's one scene where he comes off and removes 2 bits of hair pieces. I mean, he's still
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Why do you think that in this movie, it's pretty interesting because, the kind of character that Bing plays in this movie, it's a movie directed by George Seaton. It's a character that in some ways could be, it's not exactly the same, but it could be comparable in terms of drama to Sinatra in The Man with the Golden Arm. And we do talk a lot about, there's a lot of talk about that film and Sinatra's appearance on it and his performance, but I feel like The Country Girl is not a movie that is talked about very much, as though it's a little bit forgotten, and not forgotten necessarily, but I don't think it has garnered the attention that I think it deserves from the the quality of the performances for both Grace Kelly and Bing Crosby himself.
Because it doesn't reappear very often. I mean, the other big film, which you're getting onto, is White Christmas, which came out in August. And I only discovered the other day there's a Facebook page for White Christmas the movie, and there's 54,000 people on that Facebook page, and the stuff they're putting stuff out every day. Watched the film last night. You won't get that enthusiasm for The Country Girl because it's a serious drama and all the rest. But White Christmas has been, which Bing wasn't too impressed with at the time, has been an incredible success. It's been shown all over the States at the moment, isn't it, Anton?
Yeah, absolutely.
Keep reading. Yeah, incredible success.
It's funny how it was such a success when you look at some of the things that didn't work out from the start, like the fact that Danny Kaye, I think, was around third choice for the role. Also with I think Rosie Clooney gets a rough deal being the older sister of Vera Ellen, who in real life was actually younger than Vera Ellen. I think also
that looked all right on the screen, though, didn't it? That sort of worked on the screen.
Yes, it did.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And when Ken mentioned earlier about Bing's voice at that time, the resonance and the tone in songs like Count Your Blessings, it comes across as strong as ever and as good sounding as ever.
You know what?
It's interesting, isn't it, that those two films? I mean, the 53, the first one, the Country Girl. If Bing still had a future in movies, it should have been in roles such as the one he played in The Country Girl, because the role was perfect for a man of his age and background, whereas White Christmas was, again, with the exception of High Society, was absolutely the last throw of the dice for Bing to kind of be the one who, or one of the ones who gets the girl, as it were, because he was too old for that role. Throughout White Christmas, he was too old for the bit that he would have played in the war, and then he was easily too old for the role he was playing. I mean, arguably Danny Kaye was as well, but it was more obvious with Bing that he was kind of, almost looked old enough to be Rosemary Clooney's father or Vera father.
I think that was heightened even more in Road to Hong Kong, wasn't it? Which was
absolutely. Absolutely. But he never really found more country girl type roles, did he? I mean, there was a
Man on Fire.
Man on Fire was a little bit like that, I guess. I mean, second time, High Time had an element of realism about it. Hong Kong was no way. And
no, but really, the last couple of films, although they, particularly Stagecoach, wasn't a particularly good film, but again, that was a role well suited to being playing Doc Boone, and even the TV film, the Dr. Cook's Garden. That's hard to believe when you watch that's Bing Crosby from, say, High Society or White Christmas. Because again, it's a pure acting role.
If you go back to Country Girl, I mean, what I think we now know, having had 2 volumes of Gary Giddings' books. I mean, there's a very telling line in the second one where he talks about being in 1940, going home to the house in Beverly Hills, worn out from a day of being Bing Crosby. A very clear statement that the man and the personality were 2 quite separate things, and that's what you see exactly in The Country Girl. You see that ability of the character in The Country Girl to sort of turn on the image, the persona that the public wants to hear. There's that wonderful little bit where he comes off the stage, and one of the there's a extra or somebody, a lady there saying she's worried about something, and Bing just immediately comes into character, puts her at ease, and then goes back into the dressing room and he's almost in pieces. I mean, not suggesting that Bing the man was in pieces quite like that, but that dichotomy between the performer and the person was clearly there.
Yeah, that's a great moment in that film, actually, isn't it? To say between the contrast, and I think as he wanders onto the stage, the little old lady says, "Could you ever have been a kinder star," or something like that.
Yeah.
Again,
That's where I think that movie is the most at its most autobiographical, not in the sense of a has-been singer, because Bing Crosby in 1954 is not, clearly not, a has-been singer. He's still on radio, he's on TV, he's on records, he's still successful. But I think that idea of the persona of the everyman Bing Crosby, the kind of like the mask he has to don every time he's out in public, versus the more private person, or the more the kind of person he was behind closed doors. I think that's something that you can see in the movie. I totally agree. And then you think of Bing Crosby usually as an actor, and you think of the ease, the comedy, the wit, the songs, right? But you don't think that much about Bing Crosby as a dramatic actor. But I think that The Country Girl and other films of his show that he could have been a good dramatic actor if he had, worked at it, and if he had actively looked for those kinds of roles. I just feel like, I don't know how you feel about this. I would say that in general, Bing Crosby seems by the mid 1950s to have lost interest in being in the public eye. And he's more interested in fishing and hunting and playing golf than he is in, making records and appearing on television and making movies. I mean, I don't know if maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but I do feel like there's a little bit of that. By that time, his career was already, 30 years old, just about.
Well, I think that's right, Anton. I think he definitely was, but I think we're right to be focusing on 54 as a sort of start of a process, because what you see in The Country Girl is a character who's had a persona that's clearly worked and has made him into a major star, but then for reasons of the drink and the loss of his son, so on in the film, the star loses confidence in the persona. He doesn't believe the persona will work anymore with the public. Now, I think eventually Bing himself got to that point, probably not for another 10 or 15 years, but by the time he got into the mid-60s, I think Bing had lost confidence in the ability of the Bing Crosby personality to actually win the day. And I mean, again, he seemed to find it again in the last 2 or 3 years of his life, as evidenced by the 75 Parkinson's show that we've all been talking about, where clearly was back to that confidence, the bit of swagger about him, the knowledge that it would work. But for many years through the 50s, he was increasingly starting to lose confidence, and he almost, in a way, kind of talked himself into that, because the John Scott Trotter letter is almost the beginning of it.
Yes.
Being almost putting it, you almost wonder when he wrote that letter, did Bing really believe that? And as we touched on earlier, he was almost as though he was kind of looking for a reason, because he wanted to, spend more time hunting and fishing and so on. He was almost looking for a reason, but eventually he started to believe it.
Yeah. Yes, in 1966, he was interviewed by a bloke called Jim Day. It's there in Day by Day somewhere. What he actually says that it doesn't sound so good anymore. He puts a record on of his own, and after a few seconds, he takes the pickup off the record. It just doesn't sound so good anymore. That's what he says in '66.
Yeah.
But
there's a lovely piece I have from my Michael Holiday archive. Michael Holiday tracked him down in '61 in England to a golf course somewhere. And Val Parnell was there, who was the man behind the big Sunday night, the London Palladium show. And Bing said to Val Parnell, "You should put Michael Holiday on the Palladium." And Holiday said, "No, you need to put Bing on the Palladium." And Bing said, "No, I'm through."
Yeah.
That's why I was going to say
So
that
to you, that is a
guys,
process that starts now and kind of, builds up until he feels disenchanted in that way.
Hmm. I
Yes, his
think so.
priorities change.
And exactly, because the one piece we've not talked about so far is what was happening in his personal life, and
Mhm.
clearly from when he met Catherine and then married Catherine, and the very quick arrival of a new family, then in the space of a few short years, his personal world changed, probably in a way he couldn't possibly have envisaged.
And the health issues continued in the early 60s. Two big operations for kidney stones, which were big operations in those days, took you some weeks, some months to get over. And you've got to be in pain before you have those operations. So again, that must be been a factor.
Yes, indeed.
So let's talk briefly then about his personal life at this time, because I think it's pretty clear that in the other departments he was doing fairly well still in 1954. Personally, I guess the most interesting bit of information about 1954 regarding his personal life is the fact that early in the year he goes on his first date with Catherine Grant, who would later become Catherine Crosby in 1957. And there are several dates throughout the year, and in a couple of those dates, apparently he came kind of close to proposing marriage, but he doesn't until later in the year, towards October or so, towards the end of the year. All of this thanks to Malcolm's research on Day by Day, because it's there with the exact dates, as though Malcolm had been there and knew exactly what had happened. But the idea the idea is that finally, towards the end of 1954, he does get around to proposing, and Catherine accepts, and the idea was that they would get married. I think Bing Crosby wanted a fairly quick wedding the following February or March or something like that, but they don't end up getting married until, I believe, 1957. How do you think that Bing Crosby's personal life kind of reflected upon his work in 1954 and his outlook on life? Is this a happy time for Bing Crosby? I mean, I suppose it is, in the sense that he is going to get married to Catherine at some point, but there are also some more difficult things that he has to deal with.
I just find that whole decision of marrying Catherine as being completely out of character. That would not have expected that of Bing had I not known that had happened. Because he comes across always as such an erudite and a very good businessman, and always got his head screwed on right. And just looking at that, at what point did he decide that was a good decision? You know what I mean? It just seems so out of character for me.
He had quite a few lady friends around that time. Mona Freeman, if he was going out anywhere and he needed company, take Mona Freeman. Then there was another girl called Betty Util or something like that, who seemed to have got very friendly, and most intimate letters to her, really. I don't know. And also, he's supposed to be be close to Grace Kelly, isn't he, at that time? Bewildering.
But there's a reference somewhere again, and I was flicking through the Day by Day 1954 yesterday, and again, I don't know whether it's a press article or something, but it talks about Bing being clearly on a quest to find a new, younger wife. So
and again, that's the bit I find to be the surprise, because had he met somebody and married somebody who was 10 years younger and wasn't thinking about having a second family, and it was a companion or whatever, I can totally understand that. But knowing he went into that marriage knowing that there must have been a big chance of having a young family again. So it couldn't have been a surprise to him. I'm sure that was something he must have decided before they got married.
Well, he 54 and she was 23, something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's obviously an important decision in his personal life. Of course, I'm always in the case of Bing Crosby and any other writer or musician or actor that I'm interested in. I'm always wondering and interested in how Bing Crosby's personal situation at a specific time in his life reflects on his work, and I think that's possibly an interesting topic to talk about. Obviously, he had his reasons for doing what he did, and for choosing to propose to this or that person, and then marrying this or that person. But I wonder if there's any way to use his work to kind of get an idea of how he was feeling at that time in 1954. Are there any pointers that maybe we could find in hindsight, of course, and we're just obviously trying to interpret all of these things that happened more than half a century ago with our own views from today. But I'm wondering if there are any pointers that we can find about that. Is his work reflective of the position that he was in personally at that time?
Maybe "Oh Baby Mine, I Get So Lonely." Maybe there was more to that than we realized.
Well, I mean, possibly one thing was that throughout sort of those years, 54 and those years in the 50s, there was this emerging friendship with Rosemary Clooney, which was, I think, never more than a friendship from all the research Malcolm and I did around that. But clearly was something that worked very well between two people for whom there was an age gap of 26, 25 years between them. And whether that in some way, sparked Bing into thinking that a relationship with a much younger woman could actually work and bring him something that he was lacking. I don't know, maybe.
Possibly.
So, as a way to kind of, wind down our conversation about Bing Crosby in 1954, I think we have established in the past hour or so that this was a pivotal year in Bing's career, both personally, professionally. And we'll look at his legacy from the point of view of today. It is clear that this is a very important year in his career. In December, you mentioned, I think, Malcolm, that he appeared on Person to Person, hosted by Edward R. Murrow. I've always loved Murrow's voice as well, and his demeanor on camera. It's kind of old-fashioned by today's standards, but it's just
the cigarettes, you mean?
Well, of course, yes, but pretty much everyone was doing that in those days, right? Yeah. But it's like he has a certain presence on TV that's very special to me. That I think that that interview is very telling of what we were talking about before, because it presents once again Bing Crosby, the persona, not so much the man behind that persona, even though the idea for this TV show is to interview somebody, and this somebody showing you or leading you behind his closed or her closed doors. But I don't think this really happens in this. I mean, I've seen it several times, and again, it looks like Bing Crosby playing Bing Crosby again, and I think that might be part of what he was so unhappy and so tired about, and so tired of. Do you remember watching that on YouTube, or what do you think about that interview? I find it pretty fascinating.
Yes, it was fascinating, absolutely.
I agree with you. I've never thought it was a real look behind the curtain, though, at all. I don't think there ever was an interview with Bing that was a genuine look behind the curtain in that sense. I think when he died and Phil Harris was described as the man who really knew Bing, and Phil Harris said, "Well, if I'm the guy who really knew Bing, then nobody knew Bing."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There was that interview he did with the famous TV interview in May 1977 when he says,
Barbara Walters.
That's it. Thank you. Yeah.
The one where it's raining, right? And they're
Yes.
under an umbrella.
Yes. That's as close as it gets, actually.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Yes, it was a mistake that I thought by him to talk about kicking his daughter out and those kind of things. I thought that was unlike him.
Yeah. And just a different way of looking at 1954. Or if Bing had died in 1954, do you think he would be as strongly remembered now as he is?
Yes, I think he would be.
That's a very good question.
Because of White Christmas, mainly, I think. Yeah, I think he would have been.
I think in order to answer that question, I think I would say yes, mainly because most of the things that Bing Crosby is remembered for, he had already done. Now, of course, he hadn't done the duet on The Little Drummer Boy and Peace on Earth with David Bowie yet, which is very iconic especially for younger generations, right? But everything else, the movies we remember him for, the recordings, especially White Christmas, and the movie White Christmas, of course, he would have done it towards the end of his life if he had died in 1954.
The reason I would disagree slightly is because the strength of White Christmas has come through the generations, through the TV shows, I think, more than the movie and the records. I think that sustained the popularity, or helped sustain the popularity of the song. So you're right about the duet with Bowie, but if you think, as you said, everything that we talk about, he'd already done. The film White Christmas, all of the road films pretty much, apart from Hong Kong. I think it was just the TV. I think who was the guy in the UK, the critic Barry Norman said that Bing was a TV superstar, but he certainly wasn't in '54. That came much later. So I think that would be the only side that would be missing compared to Bing dying in '77 to
if he was going to die, it should have been '56 after High Society. That would have been the right timing. That would have been.
Well, fortunately, that didn't happen, and he enjoyed a later career, what we call the latter day Bing, with some great recordings, many of them made in the UK in the 1970s. I know many people for whom that is the best period of Bing Crosby's career. I think it's very good, but I personally wouldn't say the best because I like the earlier Bing. But in any case, I have two more questions for you to close this conversation today. One has to do with White Christmas. I've always wondered, and Malcolm and I have talked about this before, but why do you think that White Christmas, the film, is shown so much these days, whereas Holiday Inn seems to have been sort of pushed to the side and forgotten? It's almost impossible to find Holiday Inn on American television anymore, whereas White Christmas is everywhere to be found.
I think the obvious thing is the production itself, being in Technicolor, being widescreen. It looks like a much more modern film, doesn't it? It's only in recent years that Holiday Inn was colorized, and that colorization is an absolutely superb job, by the way. But again, before that, if you looked at the two films next to each other, black and white, Fred Astaire. And I just think it's the production values of 1954 were probably, even that time, would have seemed quite modern. I could say I think it was the first VistaVision film. I know there was a lot of new gimmicks. I think probably things like
blackface scene, of course, in Holiday Inn didn't help it, did it? Nowadays.
I agree with Jason. I think it's entirely down to the production, because on any other comparison, Holiday Inn wins hands down, doesn't it? The songs in Holiday Inn are way better than the songs in White Christmas. Fred Astaire way better than Danny Kaye. Okay, maybe the ladies were stronger performers in White Christmas, but it's Holiday Inn is 12 years older, and it portrays a sort of pre-war world, doesn't it? And it's a a lot changed in those 12 years, the war and after the war. So it's Holiday Inn has a much bigger challenge to appear relevant than White Christmas does.
Well, the song itself came to the fore, really, didn't it, during the war? And in fact, the White Christmas, the film, has that opening scene during wartime.
Yeah, I do agree with Malcolm about the blackface scene. I don't think that helps it at all, even though, if you think about it, White Christmas does include songs that mention the minstrel show, even though, of course, in that case, fortunately, they were not done in blackface. And so, that element is gone from White Christmas, but it is not from Holiday Inn, even though the intention, I think, of that scene is not derogatory in any way. That's the way that I look at it, but I do understand the concerns about that scene, which in many ways make Holiday Inn a movie that's harder to play on television to present day audiences, where White Christmas is much safer. Both movies, I think, are great entertainment, and White Christmas, of course, also has songs by Irving Berlin. So that's the cream of the crop right there when we're talking about songwriters from the songbook. And then my final question to close this conversation, I'd like to thank the three of you, because it's always a lot of fun to talk about Bing Crosby. And, when I get to do it with, people who are as knowledgeable and as experienced in his life and his music, it's even better. Even though we didn't have any music today, but just the conversation is wonderful. So my final question is, if you had to choose a couple of highlights from 1954, whether it be cinematic or musical, or on radio or in Bing's personal life, what would those be? For me, for sure, I would say it would be the musical autobiography, because I've always loved this album. I even recorded tapes of this to play in the car when my car had a tape player years ago. And I just know this, in this case, CD set by heart, down to Bing Crosby's presentations of some of the songs, where he talks about the C-level baritone and the +4s and all of that stuff. But what would you say? It doesn't have to be just one. It could be a couple. It could be three. What would you recommend from 1954 for both fans and non-fans alike?
Oh, well, let me go first. I agree with you about the autobiography set, Anton. I think that's a standout. And for me, it's the first two. What were the first two LPs in there? The new recordings he did. I just love. But I think the other thing would be the Pitchman song from Country Girl. I just think that is so much in that, and the way it starts of being reticent and lacking in confidence, and then flicking a switch and going into that persona of that song. That was clearly something he had an ability to do, and something he probably did every day of his life, because of this difference between Bing Crosby the man and Bing Crosby the personality that he created. And I think it's that song really captures all that. That scene, rather, not that song. That scene in the film captures all of
that. I totally agree. That's my favorite scene in that movie, and that's a movie that I think deserves more attention, more credit than it has garnered so far. That's that's something I've always thought about that film, The Country Girl. What else?
I'll go next, if that's okay. Let Malcolm go last. I think we all agreed the first thing would be the autobiography set. But my favourite song recorded by Bing in 1954 is one of the tunes he recorded with Les Brown, "Sunshine of Virginia." And again, because he's pitch perfect on the song, and also it's another one of those songs which, try and imagine somebody else doing that at that time. Well, that's a Bing song for me, out and out.
That's a bit of a mystery, that session with Les Brown. I mean, I've tried to find, was it the beginning of an LP that to record two songs with Les Brown? Why did that suddenly happen? Why didn't it continue?
Mhm.
And incredibly, I can't get details from the American Federation of Musicians. They can't find details of the session. So it's weird, but both songs are very good. But going back to your original question, Anton, I'd pick out the film White Christmas and the film Country Girl for my highlights of 1954.
Mm-hmm. Any specific reason why you think that his contribution in cinema were, above everything else?
Well, I think they've lasted longer.
Mm.
They're still
Yeah.
popular today, whereas the autobiography said we like it, but the average man in the streets never heard of it, I would say, whereas they've heard of White Christmas, the film, and film critics will know all about The Country Girl. He was nominated he won the Oscar. Grace Kelly won the Oscar for it, didn't she?
Mm.
So those are my highlights for 54. Incidentally, Ken, having picked this out, knowing that you write for our magazine, is it going to be an article about 1954 next time?
Not next time, because I was going to do something about Bing and the Beatles for the next.
Right.
But maybe the one after that, by which time my own arrival on the scene in 1954 will have happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe the one after that.
But you can't talk about that year 1954 from that perspective, like you said before. It's a little bit like when the British writer Evelyn Waugh, he was asked about what he remembered about being born. He said, "Well, I can't remember much, but but you'll be able to talk about other things, I'm sure." And that idea of Bing Crosby and the Beatles is interesting in many ways, because we have the musical autobiography of Bing Crosby, and this year the Beatles camp have reissued the blue and the white, the blue and the red albums that are also concentrating on the entire career of the Beatles with extra tracks and new mixes and stuff like that. So it's I look forward to that article in the next issue of Bing magazine that we're going to be putting together. I just want to mention what you said about Les Brown. I think Les Brown had a band of renown that was particularly good with singers. It was a band that really featured singers very well. Doris Day, for example, of course, is the most famous of them, but not the only one. Buddy DeVito, there were several really good singers, some of them better known than others. But those two songs kind of remind me of the situation with Sinatra and Harry James, where for Columbia they recorded two songs, Castle Rock and Farewell, Farewell to Love, which I always thought would have been the beginning of an entire LP of Frank Sinatra with Harry James. And being the band that actually gave Frank his start, that would have been wonderful. It was not to be. And I feel like in this case, it's sort of the same thing, that it could have been an entire LP of Bing Crosby with Les Brown, because then we had entire LPs of Bing Crosby with Bob Scobie, with Buddy Breckman arranging and a studio orchestra for Verve. It would have been wonderful to actually have an entire album of Bing with Les Brown. So that's another one of those what ifs. What if Bing Crosby had done that? I think that would have worked really well. Unfortunately, it was not to be either.
Yeah, wasn't that Les Brown's backing at the Montreal arena? Yeah.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
I'm funny enough just watching that before we came on air today, because there's a really great camera shot of Bing during the orchestral break, and it just shows how comfortable he was with the My Time of Life song, because you see Les Brown cue him in. Bing's already looked away. He's right on cue from it.
Yeah, I think as you guys said before about Bing getting his confidence back in his persona and his ability, obviously by the time he was on stage, when you guys would have seen him in the Palladium, that confidence had come back 100%, I would have thought.
Indeed, absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like there were certain bands in the big band era that were just more sympathetic to singers than others. Benny Goodman was famous for being the opposite, whereas people like Tommy Dorsey, like Les Brown, they really thrived on their singers and really kind of ushered in what many people consider to be the end of the big band era and the dawn of this of the popular singer as a solo artist after the war, which is not totally true, because a lot of those big bands kept touring, and a lot of them actually survived into the studio days and into television. So yeah, Les Brown is a particular favorite of mine when it comes to.
It's kind of back to our theme, isn't it? Because again, in '54, there was, the letter to John Scott Trotter, which kind of draws a line almost under the relationship between Bing and Trotter. I know that Trotter still did certain things. No one else replaced John Scott Trotter then as Bing's natural musical accompanist. And, Les Brown was still there. He could have gone on with Bing for 20 years, because he was there in '76 in Montreal. It needed that association, and it needed someone to shape and cajole and encourage Bing into it. Not with the relationship with Buddy Cole notwithstanding, because he was a musician rather than a sort of band leader.
Mm-hmm. And with Buddy Cole, I always mention this, I always prefer him as a pianist than as an organist. And I don't think that has to do that much with him as a musician, but maybe, the kind of organ he was playing was not developed enough to the point where, he could show his abilities in the way that a Jimmy Smith would in the 1960s or later on. But I love Buddy Cole, and I'm glad that this exists, because it's a fine box set of the jazziest Bing could get around this time in a small group jazz setting, and that's thanks to the CBS radio show, and also to Buddy Cole as a great accompanist that he was for Bing. Gentlemen, thank you so much for spending this afternoon for you and morning for me here in the States. Malcolm Macfarlane, thanks a lot for another year of this Bing Crosby podcast that has become on my YouTube channel, Anton GF, almost like a Christmas tradition.
Well, thank you for organising it, Anton. I think this has been one of our best sessions, thanks to the arrival of Ken and Jason, who've added another dimension to our discussions. So thanks, chaps.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ken, as well, for being here and sharing your knowledge and your passion for Bing with the audience of the channel.
My pleasure.
And thanks also to Jason. Remind us when our next ICC, and I'm not talking about the International Cricket Council here, I'm talking about the International Club Crosby. Malcolm knows I'm a huge cricket fan, and that's something we always talk about, which is rare here in the United States. But the next ICC, International Club Crosby online meeting, when is that going to be?
Yes, Sunday, the 7th of January, the first Sunday of the month, as usual. And as mentioned earlier, we've got a great presentation by Bob Phillips, as well as a good start of the New Year program. I think, Ken, you're not able to join us that time.
No, I'll be in Los Angeles that night. It's just they're starting a cruise the day after, so
I'll make sure that we hit the record button, Anton, right, so that Ken can watch it on catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be in town. I think I might be in Memphis the day before with my daughter and my wife. I think we're going to take a drive to Memphis, which will take just an hour. It's just about an hour away, to do a few things with her on the 6th, but I'll be back on the 7th for another meeting. Thank you, Jason, for being here, and let's set a date for next year again, huh?
Absolutely.
Yes, indeed, yes.
Yeah.
This has been a presentation of the Jazz Flashes podcast, our yearly Bing Crosby podcast, with yours truly, Anton Garcia-Fernandez, and also Malcolm Macfarlane, Ken Crossland, and Jason Liddiard. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. We recorded it in the month of December, around mid-December of 2023, and very soon you'll be able to listen to it and watch it on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. Leave any comments underneath if you have any questions, anything to say. What are your favorite artifacts of Bing Crosby from 1954? Do you have any memories of Bing Crosby from 1954 or any other time? Leave them under this video, and we appreciate you listening and being right there as we keep the flame of Bing Crosby's life and career and legacy alive. Wherever you are, have a happy holiday, and listen to the great Bing Crosby. We'll see you again very soon. For now, so long, everybody.